They said no decent man would marry her. They said she was born under a bad sign, that her milk-white eyes saw nothing but ghosts, that her own mother wept the day she was brought into the world. They said her father had finally found a way to be rid of her, and that the price he asked was so low it was less an auction than a confession. They said the mountain trapper who came down out of the high country to buy her did not even uncover her face before he handed over the coins. He paid in silver and in beaver pelts, and he walked her out of that Wyoming town without speaking a single word to the men who had laughed at her since she was a child. Some said he was a fool. Some said he was a butcher who wanted a woman nobody would come looking for. Some said his face was so ruined by a grizzly's claws that no living woman would have taken him in daylight, and so he had been forced to buy one who could not see. And on the second night in his cabin, high up where the timber thinned into stone, when the wind was still and the stars were sharp as ice picks, she sat up suddenly in the dark and said, plain as morning, "Get the rifle. There is a man crossing the south meadow, and he means us harm." But before we come to her, we must first find him. To find him, we must climb. We must go up into the Absaroka Range in the territory of Wyoming in the late autumn of 1878 and find the cabin of a man named Eli Roan. He was 41 years old that autumn, though he looked older by 10, and he was the kind of man the high country makes when it has plenty of time and no mercy. He stood a hand taller than most. His shoulders were thick from 20 winters of running a trap line through snow up to his thighs. His beard was the color of wet pine bark, shot through with iron gray, and his eyes were the pale gray of a sky that has not yet decided whether to snow. Across the left side of his face, from the corner of his brow down past his jaw, ran 4 long furrows where a sow grizzly had laid him open in his 30th year. The scars had healed badly. They pulled his mouth a little, so that he seemed always to be on the edge of a sorrow he would not let out. He was not a cruel man. He was not a coward. He was not a drunkard. He was simply alone, and he had been alone for a very long time. The story of why he was alone was a short story, and he did not tell it. His wife Hannah had died of a fever in the summer of 1871 in a small log house down in the valley near the South Fork. Their boy had died 3 days before her. The boy had been called Samuel, and he had been 4 years old, and he had liked to sit on his father's boot and ride along the room laughing. Eli had buried them under a yellow pine and walked away from that valley and gone up the mountain. He had stayed up the mountain for 7 winters. He came down twice a year, once in spring to sell pelts at the trading post at Cody's settlement, and once in autumn to buy flour, salt, coffee, powder, lead, coal oil, and whatever small thing he could not make with his hands. In the autumn of 1878, he came down for his coffee and his flour. He had not come down meaning to come home with a wife. The trading post stood at a crossroads in a wide, brown valley. A wagon was drawn up in the dust beside it, and a small crowd of men stood around the wagon. Eli would have passed by, only one of the men was laughing in a way that made him slow his horse. On the wagon sat a girl. She was perhaps 20 years old. She was wrapped in a gray shawl, and her hair was the pale yellow of winter wheat, and her hands were folded in her lap so still that for a moment Eli took her for a doll someone had set there as a joke. Then her head turned a little toward the laughing man, and Eli saw that her eyes were open, and that they were the strange milky blue of river ice in early spring, and that they did not move when they should have moved. He understood at once. She was blind. Beside the wagon stood a thin man in a black coat, a man with a sharp red face and a fox's quick eyes. He was the girl's father. He was saying again and again that he had brought her down from a homestead near the Bighorn, that her mother had died in childbed and her 3 brothers had died of the diphtheria, that the Lord in his wisdom had spared only her, and that he could not feed her any longer, and that he asked only $15 and a good rifle to send her on with a decent man. $15, the laughing man said. $15 for a woman who cannot see her own hand in front of her face? 15 cents would be high. She can cook, said the father. She can sew. She can do anything a wife does, except read a book. She cannot see a man coming, said the laughing man, and that is the only thing a frontier wife needs to do. The other men laughed. The girl on the wagon did not move. Her face did not change. She had heard all of this before. Eli understood that too. He understood it the way you understand a hurt that has been put on someone for so long that they have stopped wincing when it is laid on again. He stepped down off his horse. He walked through the men. They quieted when they saw the scars on his face, the way men quiet when a bear walks into the corral. He stopped at the wagon, and he looked up at the girl, and the girl, who could not see him, turned her face toward the sound of his boots and waited. "Stand up," said the father, quick and eager. "Stand up, Mercy, so the gentleman can look at you." She stood up. She was small. The top of her head would have come to Eli's chin.
Her face was thin and clean and grave, and there was something in the set of her mouth that was not afraid, only tired, and tired in a way that no 20-year-old woman ought to be tired. "What is your name?" Eli said. "Mercy Lyle," she said. "How old are you?" 20 years. "You ever cook for a man before?" "I have cooked for my father since I was 9. "Can you do it without seeing?" "I have never done it any other way." He turned to the father. He said, "I will give you $12 and a bag of coffee." The father opened his mouth. He looked at the girl, and he looked at the men, and he saw that there were no other bidders, and that there was not going to be another bidder, and that the day was getting on and his horse was tired. He said, "Done." Eli paid him. The father did not look at the daughter. He took the money and the coffee, and he climbed up on the wagon, and he drove away. And he did not say goodbye, and he did not look back. And that was the last time Mercy Lyle ever heard his voice, though she could not have known it then. Eli stood at the side of the wagon. The men had gone quiet. He put his hand up to the girl. He said, "Step down, Mrs. Roan. We have a long ride before dark." She took his hand. Her fingers were cold and dry. She stepped down and stood beside him in the dust, and only then, in the smallest voice, did she say, "You did not look at my face." "I looked," he said. "You did not lift the shawl. He told me a buyer always lifts the shawl." "I am not a buyer," Eli said. "I am your husband, if you will have me, and I do not need to look at your face to know what kind of woman you are. I heard your voice." She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "Yours is rough, but it is not unkind." "It has not had much practice being kind," he said.
"You will have to be patient." He lifted her up onto the pack horse because she could not ride well, and they had 3 days of climbing ahead of them, and he led the 2 horses out of the valley and up into the trees. The men at the trading post watched them go. One of them spat in the dust and said the trapper was a fool and the blind girl would be dead by Christmas. The wind that came down off the mountains then was thin and cold and carried the smell of snow that had not yet fallen. And far above them, in a cleft of rock no living man had ever crossed, the first soft slough of the season slid down 100 feet and stopped, gathering itself, waiting. They climbed for 3 days. He spoke to her as they went because he had learned within an hour that she needed to hear his voice to know where he was. He named the country for her. He said, "There is a stand of aspen here, yellow as butter, leaves shaking in the wind." He said, "We are crossing a creek now. There are 3 flat stones. I will lift you over." He said, "On your right hand, far off, you can hear that hollow whistle. That is a bull elk calling for his cows." She tipped her head when he said this. She smiled, very small, and said, "I hear 2 of them. There is a younger one farther up the ridge." Eli stopped his horse. He listened a long time. He heard nothing. Then, faintly, he heard it. A second whistle, thinner, higher, coming down from a draw she could not see, from a direction he had not faced. He did not say anything, but he marked it in his mind. The cabin sat in a clearing at the base of a great north slope. It was made of squared logs, chinked with mud and moss, and it had a stone chimney and a sod roof and a single window of oiled deerskin. There was a lean-to for the horses, a smokehouse, a root cellar dug into the hill, and a creek that ran fast and cold not 20 paces from the door. Behind the cabin, the mountain rose up steep into stone and snow, and the wind off that slope in winter could strip a man down to nothing in the time it took to fetch a bucket of water. He lifted her down. He led her into the cabin. He took her hand, and he laid it on each thing as they came to it, slow and patient, the way you teach a child the names of the world. "This is the door, and the latch is here. This is the table, 3 steps from the door.
This is the stove, iron, hot when it is going. This is the wood box, full to the lid. This is the cupboard, flour, salt, coffee, sugar, dried apple, bacon. This is the bed. The bed is yours. I will sleep on the floor by the stove until you tell me different." She stood very still. She turned her face up to him. She said, "You are a strange man, Eli Rohn." "I am no kind of man at all," he said. "I am only what is left of one. But you will not be hurt here, not by me, not by anyone if I can help it."
That first night, he made her a stew of venison and turnip and wild onion. She ate 2 bowls of it. He watched her eat without seeming to watch. She held her spoon delicately, and she felt the rim of the bowl with her thumb every now and then to know where the spoon would land, and she did not spill. When she was done, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, very still, the way she had sat on the wagon, and he understood that she was waiting to be told to do something, the way a dog waits. "Mercy," he said, "in this house you will not wait for orders. In this house you will do what you please." "What I please," she said, as if the words were a foreign tongue. "What you please," he said, "and if you do not yet know what that is, you have time to find out." She sat a long time. Then she said in a small voice, "I have never had time before." The second night was the night she sat up in the dark.
He had banked the stove and laid down on his bedroll near it, and the cabin was full of the small breathing of a house at rest, the creak of cooling iron, the soft tick of pine needles brushing the sod roof. He had been almost asleep when he heard her stir. She was sitting upright in the bed. Her white face was turned toward the south wall. Her milk-pale eyes were wide. "Get the rifle," she said. "There is a man crossing the south meadow, and he means us harm." He sat up. He listened. He heard nothing. The wind was still. The creek was running. An owl somewhere up the slope was speaking once, twice, 3 times to itself. "Mercy," he said gently, "you have had a long ride and a strange day, and—" "His horse is favoring the off hind," she said. "Listen to the step. 1 soft, 3 hard. He is leading it, not riding. He is walking on dry grass and trying to walk on the wet patches. He is being quiet on purpose. A man who is being quiet on purpose is not a man bringing good news." Eli Rohn had lived 20 winters in those mountains. He had survived a grizzly. He had survived 3 blizzards that had killed other men. He had not survived all of that by being a man who argued with a feeling. He took the Winchester down from the pegs above the door. He pulled on his boots. He stepped out onto the porch. He stood there in the cold dark with the rifle across his arm, and he waited. He waited a long time. He waited so long he began to feel foolish. Then, from the south, from the line of black timber at the edge of the meadow, he heard it. 1 soft step, 3 hard. A horse being led, favoring the off hind. A man trying to walk on the wet patches. The shape that came out of the trees stopped when it saw him on the porch. It stood a long moment in the moonlight. Then it lifted a hand, slow, palm out, and called across the meadow in a thin voice. "Mr. Rohn, I do not mean to startle you. I am only a traveler who has lost his way." Eli Rohn did not lower the rifle. He said, "There is no traveler's road within 15 miles of this cabin. There is one trail, and it ends at my door, and a man does not lose his way onto it. Step into the moonlight where I can see your hands." The man stepped forward. He was thin, sharp-faced, dressed in a long coat. He had a pistol on his hip, and there was a coil of rope on his saddle that should not have been on a traveler's saddle. He smiled, careful and slow. "I am looking for a young woman," he said, "a blind woman. I have been told she came up this way with a trapper. Her father has changed his mind. He sent me to bring her back. He is willing to refund your money and pay you something for your trouble." "Her father sold her this morning in Cody's settlement," Eli said. "He sold her, and he turned his wagon, and he drove east, and he did not look back. He has not had time to ride to wherever you came from, and he has not had time to send you here, and there is no other man on earth who has the right to come asking after my wife." "Your wife," said the thin man, and the smile widened a little, and there was no warmth in it. "She is your wife already, then?" "She is." "All the same," said the thin man, "I have come a long way. Perhaps I might come in and warm myself, and we might talk over a cup of coffee." "You may not come in," Eli said.
You may turn that lame horse around, and you may walk it back down the way you came, and you may tell whoever sent you that the woman called Mercy Lyle is not coming off this mountain. Not for money, not for words, not for rope." The thin man's eyes flicked just once to the coil on his saddle. He had been certain Eli could not see it from that distance, in that light. He said very softly, "You are a careful man, Mr. Roan." "I am a tired man," Eli said. "Walk." The thin man walked.
He walked until the timber swallowed him and his lame horse. Eli stood on the porch another full hour until the cold had eaten through his coat and into his bones before he came back inside. She was sitting up in the bed, very still, her hands folded. "He is gone," Eli said. "For tonight," she said. "Who is he, Mercy?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "His name is Caleb Stoker. He owns a piece of land south of the Bighorn that runs up against my father's piece. He wanted to marry me last spring, not because he loved me, because he wanted my father's water rights, and my father had no son left to leave them to, only me. And Mr. Stoker thought a blind wife would be a wife who could not say no. My father was willing, I was not. I told him that I would walk into the creek before I would marry that man. My father was angry. He has been angry since. I think today he found a way to be angry and rich at the same time. He sold me to you because he believed any man at that crossroads would be a man Mr. Stoker could buy off, or frighten off, or shoot. He did not expect you. Why did Stoker not come himself then?" "Because he is a coward," she said, "and because he wanted to be certain the trapper would not put up a fight before he showed his face. He sent that man tonight to listen at our walls, to see how you sleep, to see whether you keep a dog, to see if there is a second door. Tomorrow or the day after he will come himself, and he will bring men." Eli sat down at the table. He laid the rifle across his knees. He looked at her in the dim red light of the stove. "You knew all this when I bought you?" he said. "I knew some of it. I did not know if I should tell you. I thought perhaps you would put me out when you heard, or sell me on." "Mercy Lyle," he said, "look at me." Then he heard what he had said, and a small, grim smile pulled at the ruined corner of his mouth, and he said, "I mean, turn your face to me. There, listen. I bought you for $12 and a bag of coffee because that was the only way the men in that valley understood. But I did not buy you the way a man buys a horse. I took you out of that wagon because I have watched my own folk put in the ground, and I know what it is to be left over, and I will not be the man who hands you back to the people who threw you away. Stoker can come. Let him come. This cabin has stood 20 winters. It will stand him." She did not speak, but a single tear ran down out of her milk-blue eye, very slow, and she did not wipe it away because she did not yet know that he was the kind of man who would not mind seeing it. The first snow came 2 days later, soft and slow, and after the snow came the great gray stillness of the high country settling in for its long sleep. Stoker did not come the next day, nor the day after, nor the day after that. The valleys below were closing, the trails were going under. He would have to wait now, or come hard and fast through the drifts. They both understood this. They both understood it gave them time. Time became the gift she had never had. She learned the cabin in 3 days. She walked it with her hands trailing along the logs in the cupboards, and by the third evening she walked it as easily as he did. She found the broom and she swept. She found the flour barrel and she baked bread, and when he came in from chopping wood that first afternoon and smelled the bread, he stopped in the doorway like a man who has walked into a memory. He had not smelled fresh bread in his own house in 7 years. She cooked. The Lord help him, how she cooked. She made biscuits with sourdough she coaxed up out of a little crock she kept warm by the stove. She made a stew of jerked elk and dried apple and wild sage that he found himself thinking about while he was 4 miles up the trap line. She found a sack of dried beans he had owned for 2 years and not known what to do with, and she turned them into something with bacon and onion that made him close his eyes when he tasted it. She made coffee that was stronger than his coffee and somehow not bitter. When he asked her how, she shrugged and said, "I count and I listen." Coffee has a sound when it is right. So does bread. So does everything. She listened to everything. She listened to the creek, and one morning in the second week she said, "The water has dropped 2 inches since yesterday. There will be hard cold tonight, harder than yesterday." There was. She listened to the smoke in the chimney, and one evening she said, "Your damper is sticking. There is a draw on the south side that wants to pull the heat out." He climbed up and looked, and she was right. She listened to the horses in the lean-to, and one afternoon she said, "The bay mare is favoring her left fore. Not bad, but she has a stone." He went out, and the bay had a stone wedged up under the frog, and he picked it out, and the mare leaned her great warm head against his shoulder in thanks. He stood there a long time in the lean-to, with the snow falling soft beyond the open door, and he thought, very quietly, "The world has been wrong about this woman for 20 years. He began to take her with him on short walks along the meadow's edge. He described the country to her, and she described it back to him in a different language. Where he said, "Frozen creek," she said, "Thin music under the ice." Where he said, "Magpies in the cottonwoods," she said, "Those quarreling cousins." Where he said, "The wind is up," she said, "The wind is up, and it is coming down the north chute, not the west chute, and it has snow in its mouth that it has not yet thrown."
One afternoon walking back, she stopped. She turned her head a little. She said, "Eli, there is a wolf in the timber, 50 paces off our right. He has been pacing us 1/4 of a mile. He is alone, and he is thin, and he is not hunting us. He is hoping we will leave something behind." Eli stood very still. He scanned the timber. He saw nothing. Then a shadow shifted, and there, slipping between 2 firs, was a long, lean gray shape, and it slipped away when it saw it was seen. He looked down at her. She was waiting to be told whether she had been right. "Mercy," he said, "how do you do it?" She thought about it a long time. They were standing in the snow, and the air was cold enough that their breath went up in plumes, and she had her small, mittened hand in the crook of his elbow. "My mother used to say," she answered slowly, "that the Lord does not take a thing without giving a thing. When I was very small, before I could remember, I had a fever, and when the fever went, my eyes were gone. My mother said that the Lord then opened up the rest of me, the way you open a window in a stuffy room. And so I hear what other people hear, only louder, and I hear under it. I hear the small thing inside the big thing. A horse stepping crooked under the sound of a horse stepping. A man being quiet on purpose under the sound of the wind. The mountain talking to itself." She paused. She tipped her face up toward him. "My father called it a curse. He said I heard things that were not there, and that I scared the neighbors. He whipped me, once, for telling him that the well had cracked on the north side a week before it went dry. I had heard the water change. I did not tell him such things again." Eli Rohn said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very low, "If I ever meet your father again on this earth, Mercy Lyle, the Lord will have to forgive me a few choice words." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and the sound of it went into him deep and stayed there. That night, sitting by the stove, he asked her if she would like him to read to her. She said yes in a small voice that no one had ever read to her. He had only 3 books in the cabin, a Bible his mother had given him, a torn copy of the poems of Mr. Longfellow, and an almanac 3 years out of date. He read her the book of Ruth. He read it slow. He read the part where Ruth says she will go where the older woman goes and stay where she stays. He stopped at that part. He did not look up. He felt Mercy looking at him with her sightless eyes, and he felt his throat close, and he turned the page. He moved his bedroll on the 11th night from the floor to the long bench by the stove, which was nearer the bed. She did not say anything. She only smiled, very small, in the dark. It was on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, near sundown, that she heard the avalanche before he did. He had been splitting wood. She had been inside, kneading dough. The day had been still and cold and bright, the kind of day the high country has just before it decides to bury you. He was bringing in an armload of split pine when she came to the door, and her face was white as the snow, whiter, and her hands were clenched at her sides. "Eli," she said. "What?" "The mountain is going to slide. Now. We have minutes, maybe less." He stopped. He stood with the wood in his arms. He said, very carefully, "Mercy, the slope is stable. It has been cold and clear. There has been no fresh snow on top of old."
"There is a crack," she said, "up high. I have been hearing it for 2 days. A small creak, a small settling. The wind came up an hour ago out of the south, and it has put warm air against the north face. And just now there was a sound." She closed her white eyes, as if listening to something he could not hear even in memory. A sound like a long breath, like the mountain breathing in. "Eli, get the horses. We have to go. Now." He did not argue. He had been a man who did not argue with her feelings since the second night. He dropped the wood. He ran for the lean-to. He saddled the bay and the pack horse in a time that would have shamed his younger self. He grabbed the rifle and the powder and a wool blanket. He swung Mercy up behind him on the bay. He kicked the horse hard, and they went south, away from the slope, down the trail toward the meadow, and the pack horse came galloping after. They were perhaps 200 yards from the cabin, perhaps a little more, when the mountain spoke. The sound was not loud at first. It was a deep, low groan, the way ice groans on a great lake before it breaks. Then it grew.
Then it became a roar like nothing of this earth, the sound of 1,000 freight trains, the sound of God clearing his throat. And Eli looked back over his shoulder. A wall of white was coming down the north face. It came down with whole pines tumbling end over end inside it like broken matches. It came down across the clearing. It struck the cabin, and the cabin disappeared. It struck the lean-to, and the smokehouse, and the woodpile, and the root cellar, and all of them disappeared. And then the wall kept coming, and it filled the clearing 15 feet deep, and 20 feet deep, and then 30, and the wind off of it punched at their backs like the open hand of a giant. The bay went down on her knees. Eli held Mercy on. The pack horse screamed once, and then was quiet, frightened, and standing. Snow dust filled the air around them, and the world went white, and then, slowly, the white settled, and the roar faded, and there was a silence such as Eli Roan had never heard in 20 years on that mountain. He looked back. The clearing where his life had stood was a field of broken white. A single black snag of pine pointed up out of it like a finger pointing at heaven. There was no cabin. There was no lean-to. There was no woodpile. There was nothing. Mercy was clinging to his coat. He could feel her trembling. He could also feel, against his back, the steady, almost defiant beat of her heart. "Mercy," he said. His voice was not quite his own. "If you had not come to the door—" "I know," she said. "All of it," he said. "All of it would have been—" "I know." He turned the bay south. He could not think yet about what they had lost. The night was coming.
They had what they had on their bodies and what was in his saddlebag and on the pack horse, which, by some mercy, he had loaded that morning with 3 days of jerky, a small sack of beans, a coffee tin, a pot, and the wool blanket. They had no roof. They had 2 horses, 1 rifle, 12 cartridges, and each other. He took her down off the mountain by the long south draw, the one Stoker's man had come up by, and he made a camp that night in a hollow beneath a great fallen spruce where the wind could not find them and a fire could be built small and hot. He did not sleep. He sat up with the rifle across his knees and watched the dark, and he watched her too. She slept curled against his side under the wool blanket, and her face in the firelight was very young and very pale and very still, and he thought, with a kind of slow astonishment, that he loved her. He thought, "I bought her for $12 and a sack of coffee, and she is worth more than every pelt I have run down off this mountain in 20 years, and more besides." In the morning he made coffee, and he gave it to her, and he told her, plain, that he had a brother in Bozeman who would take them in for the winter, and that come spring he would come back and dig out what could be dug out, and they would build the cabin again, and that he meant for her to be his wife not only in name, but in the eyes of the Lord and of any preacher she could find, if she would still have him after he had lost her a roof on her first month of marriage. She did not answer right away. She drank her coffee slowly. Then she said, "Eli Roan, you did not lose me a roof. You gave me a life. There has not been a day in 20 years that I was not someone's burden until you."
"If a roof is what we trade for that, then the trade is fair, and I will marry you anywhere and in front of anyone, and I will not need eyes to know what I am promising or whom I am promising it to." He took her small, cold hand in his huge, cold, scarred one, and he held it a long time, and there was nothing more said about it. They came down out of the high country on the second day, leading the pack horse, riding the bay double, and by the third afternoon they were on the long, flat trail that ran south toward the Wind River Valley. And it was on that third afternoon, in a stand of cottonwoods by the trail, that Caleb Stoker came out from behind a tree with 3 men, and the 3 men had rifles, and Stoker had a smile. "Mr. Roan," said Stoker, "I had not expected to meet you on the open road. I had thought I would have to come and pry you out of that cabin of yours. I see the Lord has been kind to me, or perhaps unkind to you. I have heard there was a great deal of noise on your mountain 2 days back. A great pity, a great pity. A man with no home is a man who must be reasonable." Eli Roan did not get down off the bay. He let his right hand rest on the stock of the Winchester that lay across the saddle in front of him. He looked at the 3 men. He looked at Stoker. He said, "Step out of the road." "I cannot do that," said Stoker, gentle as a preacher. "I have come a long way for the young lady, and her father has come a long way as well." He nodded behind himself, and out from the cottonwoods stepped the thin, red-faced man in the black coat, the man who had sold his daughter at the crossroads 3 weeks before. He did not look at Mercy. He looked at his boots. "Pa," said Mercy, very quietly, "you should not have come."
"He has come," said Stoker, "because he is a reasonable man, and because he understands that a paper signed in haste in a trading post is not a marriage in the eyes of God or the territory. He has come to take back what was taken, and to give you to a man who can keep a roof over your head, which is a thing this trapper has plainly failed to do." There was a silence. The wind moved in the cottonwoods. One of the 3 men, a young man with a thin mustache, shifted his weight, and the leaves under his boot crackled in a particular way, and Mercy, sitting behind Eli with her arms around his waist, tipped her head and listened, and then she said, very softly, into Eli's ear, "The young one on the left, he is afraid. He is the only one. The 2 older ones have done this before. The young one has not, and his hand is shaking on his rifle. If you speak to him, gentle, he will go." Eli did not move his face. He said aloud, "Stoker, the young man on your left there, what is his name?" Stoker frowned. "Why?" "Because I want to know whose blood I am to wash off this trail when this is over. I should like to send a letter to his mother." The young man with the thin mustache went a shade paler. Stoker said sharply, "His name is no business of yours." "His name is Tom Beasley," said the young man, and his voice cracked on it. "And I have only been with Mr. Stoker since the spring, and I—" "Quiet!" snapped Stoker. "Tom Beasley," said Eli, calmly, looking only at the young man. "I have killed 2 men in my life, both in self-defense, and both of them have visited me in my dreams every winter since. I do not wish to kill a third. You have a mother somewhere, and she is not paid enough by Mr. Stoker to bury you. Step back into the trees. Walk south. Do not look behind you. I will not fire on a man who is walking away." The young man's eyes flicked to Stoker. They flicked to the 2 older men. They flicked to the gray scars on Eli's face, and to the steady big hand on the rifle, and to the small, still woman behind him, whose milk-blue eyes were turned somehow exactly toward him, as though she were looking through him at his soul. He swallowed. He lowered his rifle. He stepped back. He stepped back again. Then he turned and he walked, and he kept walking, and the cottonwoods took him. Stoker's face had gone white with rage. "The next man who steps back," he said low, "I shoot myself." "Mr. Stoker," said Mercy then, and she spoke loud enough for all of them to hear, and her voice was strange and clear and certain. "There is a posse coming down the trail behind you, 4 riders. They will be here in the time it takes a man to count 200. The sheriff out of Lander has been looking for you since August on a different matter, and one of those 4 riders is wearing his star. I can hear it ringing on his coat. If you are wise, you will be gone from this road before they round that bend." Stoker laughed, ugly and short. "She is bluffing. She is blind. She cannot hear a thing." "Listen," said Mercy. They listened. For a moment there was only wind. Then, faintly, from down the trail to the east came the soft, regular sound of hooves on packed dirt. Several hooves, coming on at a steady working trot, coming closer. The two older men with Stoker looked at each other. One of them was already lowering his rifle. The other said, low and fast, "Caleb, we did not sign on for the law." "Wait," said Stoker. "We did not sign on for the law," the man said again, and he stepped back, and the second older man stepped back with him, and within a breath they were both gone into the cottonwoods, and there were hoofbeats fading west through the brush, and there was only Caleb Stoker and the thin, red-faced father standing in the road. The father was looking at the ground. The father had not moved. The father, in fact, was crying in a quiet, broken way, the way a man cries who has finally been shown a mirror. Stoker raised his pistol. He raised it not at Eli, but at Mercy. He said, "You will not take her from me. You will not." Eli's Winchester came up. It came up very fast, faster than a man with that much gray in his beard should have been able to bring it up, and there was a moment of perfect stillness, and then, from down the trail, a voice called out, sharp and authoritative, "You there! Drop the iron! Drop it now!" Stoker froze. He looked east. 4 riders had rounded the bend, and the front rider had a tin star on his coat, and the star caught the late sun. Stoker dropped the pistol. He stood very still. He did not look at Mercy. He did not look at Eli. He looked, perhaps, at the long road of his own life, and at where it had ended, and at how it had been ended by a blind girl with sharp ears.
The sheriff of Lander was a man named Ezra Cobb, and he had been looking, as Mercy said, for Caleb Stoker since August, on a matter of cattle stolen out of a draw south of South Pass. He had also been looking for one Hiram Lyle on a matter of a daughter sold against the law in a public crossroads, on the complaint of a circuit preacher who had ridden through Cody's settlement the day after and heard the whole sorry tale. Sheriff Cobb took both men into custody, and he tipped his hat to Mercy, and he said, "Ma'am, I have heard a tale or two about you these past weeks. I do not know how much of it is true, but I will say this. You have a way of being in the right place at the right time, and the territory could do with more of that." "It is not the place," said Mercy. "It is the listening." Sheriff Cobb thought about that. He nodded slowly. He took his men and his prisoners away east down the trail. The father, Hiram Lyle, in the moment before he was led away, lifted his head and looked at his daughter. He opened his mouth. He shut it. He opened it again. He said, "Mercy." "Pa," she said, not unkindly. "I am sorry," he said. She was quiet a long while. Then she said, "I forgive you, Pa. I forgive you because I am told I must, and because I have found that I am rich enough in other ways now that I can afford it. But I will not come home with you. I have a home." He nodded. He let himself be led away. He did not look back, and this time she did not need eyes to know that he did not, and this time it did not hurt her, because she had a husband on the horse in front of her, and his back was warm, and his hand on hers was steady. They were married that next Sunday in a small white church in the town of Lander by a circuit preacher with a white beard and kind eyes who took no fee. Mercy wore a borrowed dress of pale blue.
Eli Roan wore his good wool coat and his only clean shirt, and he stood very straight, and when the preacher asked if he took this woman to have and to hold, the great scarred trapper said, "I do," in a voice that cracked like a boy's, and a woman in the back pew, a stranger, began quietly to cry. They wintered with Eli's brother in Bozeman. Come spring, they went back. They dug. They found what they could. It was not much. They built again. Eli felled the trees and Mercy mixed the chinking, and by the end of summer there was a new cabin, smaller than the first, set a quarter-mile further down the slope where the mountain could not reach, and over the door Eli carved with his pocket knife 3 words, and the words were her name and his name, and underneath the word home. The years after that ran on the way good years run, which is to say quickly and without much story to them. There were 2 children, a boy they called Samuel after the first one, who did not live, and a girl they called Hannah after the first one, who did not live either. And these 2 children grew up strong and quick and clear-eyed in the high country, and they had a mother who taught them to listen and a father who taught them to be still. The boy, when he was 8, came in one summer evening from the meadow and said, casual as you please, "Ma, there is a black bear sow with 2 cubs in the upper draw, and she is in a poor temper because one of the cubs has got into a porcupine." His father, hearing this, looked at his mother, and his mother smiled her small smile and said only, "Then we will leave her be, son. A woman in a poor temper is owed her quiet."
Eli Rohn died in his bed in the spring of 1904 of an old man's tired heart, and he died holding his wife's hand, and the last thing he heard was her voice telling him, very quietly, that there was a meadowlark on the post outside the window and that it was singing the song he liked. He smiled when she said it. Then he was gone. Mercy lived 9 years after that. She lived alone in the cabin most of those years, with her son and his wife in a smaller cabin built beside it, and she was known in those mountains by then. She was known as the blind woman of the Absaroka, who could tell weather 3 days out, who could tell a man's intentions by his step, who had once heard an avalanche before it fell and saved her own life and her husband's. Trappers came down from further north sometimes to ask her things. Cattlemen came up from the south. A young Crow woman came across the mountains once, 3 days' ride, to ask her about a dream her mother had been having.
Mercy listened to all of them. She gave what answers she had. She charged nothing. There is one more thing worth saying. In the spring of her last year, an old man came up the trail to the cabin on a thin, gray mule. He was bent. He was nearly toothless. He had served the last of a long sentence in the territorial prison at Laramie. He stood in the yard a long time before he could find his voice. When he did, he said, "Mercy, daughter, I have come to see you before I go." She was sitting on the porch. She had not seen 60 years of light or shape or color, but she turned her face to him, and she knew him, and she sat very still. She said, "Come up, Pa. There is coffee. I heard you coming an hour ago. I had time to put it on." He climbed the steps. He sat in the other chair.
He cried, a little, the way old men cry, which is mostly silently, and she did not look at him, which was a kindness, and after a long time she put her small hand on his knotted one, and the wind moved in the pines, and the creek ran fast and cold, and somewhere up the slope a meadowlark sang the song her husband had loved, and that, in the end, was all that needed to be said between them. Years later, when travelers in the high country sat around their fires and told the stories that men tell when the dark is close, someone would always tell the one about the trapper with the ruined face who went down off the mountain one autumn for coffee and flour and came back up with a blind bride he had bought for $12. The teller would shake his head and grin and say that the men at the trading post had laughed at Eli Rohn that day and had bet against the marriage and had said the girl would be dead by Christmas.
And then the teller would lean in, and his voice would drop, and he would say that not one of those laughing men had lived to see his own old age, and that the trapper and his blind woman had lived long and full lives in a cabin under a great north slope, and that the woman, the one they had said was useless and a shame, had been the one who had heard the mountain coming. And the teller would say, almost as a kind of prayer, the thing that the story had always been trying to say. He would say that there was never anything wrong with Mercy Lyle. The wrong had always been in the world that called her wrong.
He would say that the Lord does not waste a soul, and that what looks like a curse from the outside is often a gift waiting to be heard, and that the world rewards, in the end, not the man with the sharpest eyes, but the one who is humble enough to listen to the woman beside him when she tells him the mountain is about to speak. And then the fire would burn down low, and the travelers would lie back in their blankets, and somewhere up above them, in the dark, a creek would run fast and cold, and the wind would move in the pines, and far off, very far off, almost too faint to hear, a meadowlark would sing.